We have with us Kelcie Ralph, who is an associate professor of transportation planning and policy at Rutgers University. She comes to Rutgers by way of the University of Alaska Anchorage, where for her undergrad, master's at the London School of Economics in Cambridge, and her PhD at UCLA. She's coming to us from Alaska, where she's been hiding out during the pandemic, and it's very early for her there today. So I want to thank you for getting up early to talk with us today, but she will be back in New Jersey for the fall semester. She's done some really interesting research on media coverage of car crashes, and she's going to talk about that. And she's also going to talk about pedestrian safety and the public health issue that it represents. So Kelcie Ralph, thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chris. Let me just pull up my slides, which is always more awkward than it ought to be. There we go. Okay, so first, thank you so much for having me. And thank you to all of the folks who are here, not just for listening in, but for your commitment to journalism. My first career dream was to be a journalist. And so I'm a teensy bit envious of each and every one of you. My goal today is to convince you that folks like you in the media have an important role to play in pedestrian safety. And first, I want to start by creating a sense of urgency about this issue. On a typical day in the United States, 100 Americans lose their lives in car crashes. This is like a commercial airplane falling out of the sky every other day. The loss of life on our roadways is really staggering. To make it even more concrete, I want you to think about a single highway in Florida, US Highway Route 19. It's 20 miles in length. In 15 years, 137 people died while walking along this 20-mile stretch of roadway. That's roughly the same number of people who died in all commercial airline crashes over the same 15 years. A single roadway, all airline crashes. But when a plane falls out of the sky, the coverage is constant, and for good reason. But when there's a slow accretion of deaths on our roadways, the media is largely silent, and then the coverage we do have is pretty problematic, as I'll show you today. I want to make the case for urgency even clearer. Pedestrian deaths are on the rise. So between 2009 and 2016, deaths increased 46% on our roadways. And then last year during the pandemic, when driving was way down, traffic deaths rose 7%, more than at any point in the past 13 years. I want to make one more case for urgency, and that is that this problem has deep equity implications. The victims of pedestrian deaths are disproportionately poor and disproportionately from people of color. So there's lots of reasons that we need to change what we're doing. Okay. We often think of traffic fatalities as a tragic, essentially random occurrence, but that is not the case at all. Crashes happen over and over again in places like this, talking about our urban arterials, places with very high volumes, lots of cars, high speeds, and limited pedestrian infrastructure. We call these crash hotspots. They are essentially inhospitable to people walking or biking. And that's fine if you have a car, but 10% of Americans do not own a car. And you might think, well, those 10% live in Washington, D.C. or New York City. And my research and the research of others has shown that, in fact, there are a lot of carless households in rural and suburban areas, and those carless households are forced to walk on streets like this. It's no surprise that crashes happen here eventually. This is sort of the living embodiment of the phrase, an accident waiting to happen. So with that in mind, safety advocates have begun shifting away from the word accident to the word crash or collision instead, hoping to remove that sense of randomness, right, from the equation. In fact, the British Medical Journal banned the term accident in 2001, no longer allowed to call a crash an accident. And as I set out to conduct the research I'm going to share with you today, I hoped to build on this crash, not accident pledge to identify other ways that changing our language could accelerate traffic safety reform. So today I'm going to leave you with 3 key pieces of advice. Say a driver hit a pedestrian, connect the dots between crashes, and focus on real issues and solutions. So let's jump right into it. I reviewed 200 news articles from across the United States, and one sentence stood out as the most common way to describe a crash. It was this sentence: a pedestrian was hit. The next most common was a pedestrian was hit by a car. And together, these two sentences reflect 81% of all of the headline coverage of a crash. So in other words, if someone reads a description of a crash in their newspaper, it's almost certainly this sentence or a pedestrian was hit by a car. And that's a problem because these two sentences have three big problems. First, it focuses on the pedestrian, makes the pedestrian the star of the show. And this feels like a nice gesture towards the victim, but linguistics scholars have documented that the focus of the sentence tends to garner more blame for whatever happens in the sentence. And because pedestrians are the focus in 3/4 of all crash coverage, they shoulder considerable responsibility in the eyes of readers. A second problem has to do with agency. So this sentence has no agent altogether. The pedestrian was hit, but by what, by whom? It isn't clear. And without an agent, we don't know who to hold responsible. And 1 in 3 sentences that we researched, or 1 in 3 sentences lacked an agent entirely. The third problem is that our sentences tend to use what's known as object-based language. So in sentences that did have an agent, we were 4 times more likely to refer to a car as the agent than a driver as a person as an agent. There's no autonomous vehicles yet. Someday those sentences might be appropriate, but today they're not. And again, that object-based language removes accountability from a human person. So I suggest that we fix this issue. Oh, I had notes for all of those, my bad. I suggest that we fix this issue by saying a driver hit a car, or a driver hit a pedestrian. And if necessary, we should say a driver hit a pedestrian with a car, if it's sort of unclear. Now, that's a very simple change. And you might be wondering, does it really matter? And I can say emphatically that it does, and it matters quite a bit. I know because I conducted an experiment where I had folks read different versions of the same crash story. And when people read the sort of default text, the text that we tend to see in newspapers today, they attributed 43% of the blame to the pedestrian. And when we shifted the story very slightly, no change in details at all, just we shifted the sentence to say, a driver hit a pedestrian, then readers attributed 30% of the blame to the person walking. So in other words, shifting the single sentence and the structure of our sentence reduced victim blaming by about 30%. It's kind of a remarkable finding. And I want to be really clear. I'm not asking journalists to change the facts of the story. My point is far, far subtler. Today, in the absence of information about what actually happened, so before a crash report is finished, we release a crash report to the public, and we default to this classic formulation: a pedestrian was hit. And our research is very clear that this tends to increase victim blaming. So we can correct that by making this very, very simple shift to a driver hit a pedestrian. Okay, that's point 1, sentence level issues. Let's zoom out and talk about bigger picture article level issues. And that's my advice here, is to connect the dots between crashes. You guys are journalists. You know that there are 2 ways to frame a story. There's many ways to frame a story. Here's a simple breakdown: 2 ways: episodic framing and thematic framing. And when we use episodic framing, as you know, we treat events as isolated incidents. But thematic framing sort of connects the dots between the patterns between events. Episodic framing in crashes might describe very simply who was hit, where were they hit, are there any deaths, have there been any arrests? That's sort of it. Thematic framing, by context, it's going to contextualize a story. It might include crash statistics, either local crash statistics or national crash statistics. It might include a description of the crash location, How many lanes are there? What's the speed limit? Are there sidewalks? It might note whether there's sort of known issues in the location. Have people been hurt here before? Are there bus stops? Things like that. And it might cite a transportation planner or safety advocate. So those are the two types. In our research, we found that just 16% of all of the stories that we looked at included any thematic elements whatsoever. And not a single one of them out of the 200 included a quote from a planner or a safety advocate, anyone who could speak to ways to address this problem. So in other words, our default coverage is sort of one and done, just a crash and then we move on. And again, you might be wondering, does this really have an effect? And I know once again from this experiment that I ran, we know that in other fields, thematic framing tends to sort of broaden the reader's view. If they have episodic framing, they tend to focus on the individuals in the story, blame the people. But if there's thematic framing, we tend to think of systems problems and sort of blame the system as a whole. So the same pattern is true in crash reporting. When people read default coverage, they attributed about 7% of the blame to other factors. So not the driver and not the pedestrian. But when they had this story that connected the dots, just provided a little bit more information about the location and the number of crashes, they shifted their blame to 17% for those other factors. This might not seem like a big shift, but it does meaningfully shift the kinds of solutions that readers supported. So readers who encountered this thematically framed article were more likely to support pedestrian infrastructure, lower speeds, better enforcement on driver behavior. They were more likely to personally trade off lower speeds for fewer pedestrian deaths. And again, by contrast, folks who read that standard default article were less likely to do all of these things. And this is important because these are the types of systematic improvements that we know are effective at improving safety. Things like walk safe campaigns are not effective at improving safety. And so it's a good thing to see that they've increased their willingness to support these things. So I want to be super clear before I move on that adding these thematic elements is not a super heavy lift. I'm talking about adding local and national crash statistics. I'm talking about using Google Street View to describe the location, and bonus points if you can talk to someone who's a safety expert or a transportation planner. Doesn't even have to be a local one, right? There are national advocates who work on these issues and can offer a very easy quote to add into these articles. So before I move on, I want to make one historical aside that I think you guys might enjoy. When cars were first invented in the United States and they were just becoming really prolific, the death toll on our roads was extraordinary. Children in particular were dying right and left. There were riots in the streets, real literal riots, like people beating up drivers. And in part, the news routinely blamed drivers for what was happening. We called these things automobile deaths. And we, in the media, had a story about this being about sort of vicious, speed-hungry drivers. And the automobile manufacturers, they sort of recognized that they had a problem on their hands, right? And if they didn't change this narrative, they were basically going to be kicked out of cities. And so in 1923, the National Automobile Chamber of Commerce launched their own crash reporting service, a centralized news service, so that they could take this into their own hand and describe crashes in their own language. And of course, unsurprisingly, their language said things like, pedestrians were to blame more often, and they gave advice on how to stop crashes, things like don't jaywalk. And really, basically overnight, the tone and tenor of crash coverage in this country changed because newspapers would reproduce almost verbatim these crash reports from the Chamber of Commerce. And of course, there's a story there about ad revenue and power, but I just want you to see that there's historical echoes of what's happening then is happening today as well. So I promised that I would interrupt the middle of this talk for a couple of questions. And so before I do, I just want to recap real quick what we've seen. Today, we have a major public health issue, right? Crashes are killing lots of people, an increasing number of people, but our default coverage tends to dampen public outcry. And that is happening at two levels, the sentence level and the thematic level. So before we talk about anything else, I want to open the floor to a couple minutes of questions about those issues.
Anybody have a question? Orion.
Thanks. I guess I'm just thinking it's really interesting, and this makes a lot of sense. And it's something that I'm going to maybe share with some of my colleagues who do local coverage, who deal with this kind of thing more day to day. But I'm wondering what, those who focus on the federal government should make of all this, and how we can incorporate this in our reporting.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think that every time we talk about things like the infrastructure bill, which I'm guessing folks are following, it's important to sort of call out these safety issues, right? Are the investments we're making and proposing in the infrastructure bill, are they likely to exacerbate these problems? Or are they likely to sort of improve safety outcomes for the most vulnerable? I think a fair assessment of what's happening is that they won't improve safety all that much. The infrastructure bill is mostly a highway bill.
Okay, Kadia?
You might touch on this a little later, but I'm curious how state versus the federal, like different highways or streets, are willing to compromise or talk about lowering speed rates. Is it more difficult to do, because there are a lot of federal highways in the middle of cities? So I'm curious how that works.
Right. So that's a super good question. The big federal highways tend to have pretty low crash rates, actually. They're pretty safe. The real issue is those arterial streets. So imagine a street with a Walmart and a Target and a McDonald's. Those are the ones where we have disproportionate number of crashes. The thing is, those tend to be owned and operated by state DOTs. So you might have a local agency, a local city who's very excited about reducing speeds, but many states have preemptive rules that do not allow them to reduce speeds on state highways. In my own town of New Brunswick, there is a state highway that runs right through the middle of my city, lots of pedestrian deaths and lots of pedestrian injuries, but the state has forbidden us from lowering the speed limit to make our own main street safer. And that's a pattern that plays out all across the country.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions for this block? Let me ask one question about the timing of the historical incident, or the historical framework that you gave us. So that was in the early 1920s that there were riots in the streets because of auto crashes with pedestrians, and then then the Automobile Association, or the precursor organization, came out with its crash reporting in 1923. Is that what you said?
Yeah, 1923 is when the crash reporting started. And from about 1910 till then, there were, like I said, riots in the streets, big safety parades. And it's wonderfully detailed in this book by Peter Norton that I highly recommend. It's a delight to read.
Okay, thanks.
As a side note, I went back and checked my stories when I was a local TV reporter. I did indeed say a driver hit a pedestrian every time.
I do it when I speak too. It's so ingrained. So don't hold yourself too accountable, but we can change what we do moving forward. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about distracted pedestrians for a second, because it's another really problematic way that we talk about safety. And then we can open up to questions about everything else. So part two of the talk, third piece of advice: focus on real problems and real solutions. So here is just a sampling of headlines from the national press about distracted walking. These have taken place now over the past couple of years. we still see the same kind of coverage today. This one in particular is really egregious. I like to highlight it. Distracted walking causes more injuries than distracted driving. Really? Really? But here is the issue, is that, and with some caveats that the numbers aren't great, distracted walking pales in comparison to known crash factors, things like speeding, which is an issue in 26% of fatal crashes nationwide, or alcohol and drugs, an issue in 47%. Driver inattention. This number is from New York City, not the federal government, but 57% of pedestrian crashes in New York City are caused by driver inattention. So to be very clear, the media is not entirely to blame for this coverage that hypes up distracted walking. They have certainly been egged on by a small number of transportation safety folks. But my goal today is to show you that the evidence base for this concern about distracted walking, that evidence base is incredibly weak. Okay. And so my hope is that you will not buy into this idea that that distracted walking is a problem. And at this point in a talk, I can sort of feel skepticism coming through. And I want to be really, really clear that people certainly do walk distracted, lots of them. Based on several observational studies of thousands of pedestrians in multiple cities across the United States, we know that somewhere between 12 and 45% of people walk distracted while crossing intersections. It's not just on their sidewalk, they're actually crossing intersections while looking at their phone, using headphones, things like that. Unsurprisingly, these numbers tend to be higher on college campuses. Okay. What are they distracted by? 11% of them are using headphones, 7% of them are looking at their screen, and 6% of them are talking on their phone, although I'm sure these numbers are changing over time. But really, we don't really care if they are distracted, we care if that makes them less safe. So let's talk about the evidence for that. We know from a host of observational studies and experimental studies about how looking at your phone or using your phone changes behavior. And the good news is that using your phone to listen to music has no effect on any of the things that folks have looked at. You're just as likely to stay in a crosswalk, just as likely to look right and left. You recognize just as many gaps in traffic, and you cross at the same speed. So you might recall previously that listening to music was the most common form of distraction. Good news, doesn't seem to affect folks. What about texting or actually talking on the phone? Again, here the evidence is pretty mixed. Good news, folks who are on their phone are more likely to stay in the crosswalk and more likely to cross with the light, so less likely to jaywalk. One thing that is true is that folks who are on their phones tend to cross more slowly, but we're not talking about huge effects. We're talking about the difference between being middle-aged and over 65. So just a slight increase in the time to cross, which does expose them to more risk, but well within the realm of normal pedestrian behavior. And then there's shrug emojis, because we do not know, despite over 20 studies in the lab and in observational studies, we still don't know if folks are more likely to look both ways, less likely to look both ways, and less likely to recognize open gaps in traffic. And you would think after 20 studies, we would have a clear indication that these things were more risky or less safe. That's not the case. All right, let's talk then about the next thing, which is that really we don't care so much if it changes behavior and how much they're doing it. Really, we care if it makes them less safe. And there are three ways to tell if something makes, if walking distracted makes pedestrians less safe. We can observe them and see if they're more likely to encounter risky situations. We can conduct an experiment in the lab, which is problematic for a couple of reasons, because it's not real life and the consequences are kind of different. Or we can analyze crash data. And let me tell you, the crash data is horrible. We do not consistently ask folks if they're distracted after there's been a crash, and we do not consistently record that information. So it's just hard to tell. that important caveat in mind, let's talk about what the results say. And some of you might have actually seen this study in 2008 when it came out because it got a ton of press coverage. Single observational study so they're looking at real pedestrians and real intersections. And they found that 48% of people who were on their phone crossed unsafely. And this was much, much higher than folks who were walking sort of undistracted. Lots of media coverage at the time. It's the most cited paper in my field in transportation or traffic safety. And the problem is that it is based on an incredibly small sample. So these folks observed 25 people on a phone, only 11 of whom had a car approaching when they got to the intersection, and only 9 of whom stepped off into the curb and walked into that intersection. We're talking about 48% of a very small number of people, and a sort of weird calculation where they had somehow 12 people be unsafe, even though only 9 of them stepped off the curb. I'm sort of giving you the surface level version of this, but later I'll show you the whole citation to the papers so that you can see for yourself, where I do a very detailed job of picking apart each of these pieces of evidence. So anyways, the point here is that the evidence is incredibly weak for this observational study, but that it was cited over and over and over again. Okay, let's talk about experiments and crash data very briefly. I mentioned that experiments were kind of tricky because folks are on a treadmill in a lab. It's not real life. And based on 17 studies, some of them, they're more likely to get hit in the lab, and some of them, they're less likely to get hit. Basically another big shrug emoji. We don't know. What about crash data? Here, like I said, the data is not great, but the number of pedestrians who are injured from being distracted is likely on the order of about 5 to 10%. And it is certainly less than 20%. This is not an issue of like half or 75% of crashes being caused by distraction. Okay, it is not about distraction. What on earth could it possibly be? Well, this rise in pedestrian deaths, I should say. What on earth could it possibly be? Between 2008 and 2017, population went up 7%. Driving increased 8%. That's certainly part of the story. It's not the whole story though, because deaths per million people and deaths per million miles driven have both increased about 30% over that time. So that's not the whole story. I think a big part of the story, and one I hope that folks in the federal national media talk more about, is the rise of SUVs. So SUVs increased in circulation 37% between 2009 and 2016. And in fact, those numbers have accelerated since then. It's even a larger share now of all new car sales. You're more likely to die if you've been hit by an SUV because the grille sort of hits your internal organs and pulls you under the car. Whereas if you're hit by a traditional sedan, it sort of hits you in the lower extremities, it knocks you over the car, you're less likely to suffer serious injuries. Also, on top of that, accounting for size, vehicles are more powerful today, especially SUVs are more powerful, and folks who drive more powerful and larger cars tend to drive faster. And the number one sort of predictor of whether you survive a crash is the speed at which it happens. So the rise of SUVs is obviously a huge part of this. Distracted driving is also a really important part of this. Not sure how many of you have seen the videos of cars driving into restaurants and driving over the edges of bridges. These are folks in their cars driving at too high of speeds, distracted by what's happening on their phones. And then one more piece of evidence about why we've seen such a rise in pedestrian deaths, and that's that folks are moving to more dangerous locations. The 10 fastest growing states in the United States have a higher pedestrian fatality rate than the remaining 40 states. So there's this thing known as the pedestrian danger index, and those 10 fastest growing states have a 79% higher pedestrian danger index than the remaining 40 states. So you might be wondering, you've really gone off on a tangent. What does this have to do with the media? And I just want to bring you back to these headlines. This is sort of wall-to-wall blanket coverage about distracted walking. And this was just a tiny sampling. There were so many more. This sort of framing of the pedestrian safety issue is a problem because of the illusory truth effect. The more times we encounter an idea, the more likely we are to believe it. And if readers continually encounter this idea, this storyline, they're much more likely to blame the victim and much less likely to support those sort of systems level solutions that I was mentioning earlier. So I did say that there was a lot here, and I've only covered it at a pretty surface level. I recommend this paper that I've written if you want to learn more about distracted pedestrians. It's free and open to the public, and dare I say, a nice read. It's not sort of technical academic ease. So just to wrap up, I've left you with 3 pieces of advice. I hope you take them. And when you describe crashes, you say a driver hit a pedestrian. You connect the dots between all of the crashes and you focus on these real issues rather than blaming the victim. So that's it for my presentation. And I'm hoping that we could have a conversation about transportation and infrastructure more generally, or about how we talk about crashes.
Okay, so I have plenty of time for questions. Let's go to Arjun first.
Thank you for this presentation. Thank you for this presentation. I'll admit it's definitely something that is really illuminating right now. And so one thing I was thinking of is that I used to cover the hall in Boston, and there was a big issue about creating dividers for bike lanes because we had a lot of series of just very bad accidents, particularly on a stretch of one of the bigger streets of bicyclists getting hit by cars. And have you noticed any trends in terms of those kinds of conversations about the way that the media reports on bicycle accidents, in that sort of same sense of like putting too much blame on one party? And I guess, how do you feel like that issue should be discussed, the issue of bicycle safety and sharing the road with cars? Because I know that people on both sides have very strong feelings about who's kind of got the responsibility on the road.
Incredibly strong feelings, right? It's sort of remarkable. So lots of things in there. One, in the studies that I was looking at, half of them were about cyclists. I've used the word pedestrian throughout, but half of them were about cyclists, and exactly the same pattern came through. So if we shift that language to cyclists instead, or even better, a person riding a bike, to sort of humanize them, that's like the first baby step. But I want to talk just a little bit about research from a friend of mine, Rebecca Sanders. She's a Berkeley educated transportation scholar. And what she found in her work is that when provided with options for how the road could be divided, drivers and cyclists tended to prefer the same things. They wanted clarity about what the road and what the expectations on the roadway were. And right now, so much of the frustration comes from that lack of clarity, right? Drivers get into the situation where they're like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. Oh, and by the way, these scoundrels are breaking the rules. And cyclists are like, I'm breaking the rules because I feel unsafe and unclear about whether you're going to respect my space. So highly recommend that work by Rebecca Sanders, that basically drivers and cyclists want the same thing, and that's certainty. And she finds that protected bike lanes are the best way to provide certainty. I will say one more thing, and that is that I think physically protected bike lanes are essential. I used to think that it would be okay to have buffered bike lanes and just lots of space dedicated. But based on this growing prevalence of drivers running into restaurants and running into signs, I no longer think that it's sufficient to provide space, if that makes sense. We want a barrier for them to hit instead of a human being.
Okay, so we're going to go to Orion and then Elena, but I want to ask a question about the bike lanes. In DC, we have a handful of streets that now have protected bike lanes, even though the FedEx drivers haven't figured that out yet. But is there good research yet about whether a city that is starting to put protected bike lanes in is actually seeing a reduction in bicycle auto accidents?
Yes, I don't want to overstate the case, but it is true in places where there is a robust network of protected bike lanes. So it has to be a network. One and done is not enough. But in places with robust networks of protected bicycle lanes, you not only get really dramatic increases in biking, but you do see a reduction in crash rates. At the most extreme level, you can look at places like Copenhagen and Amsterdam, and now increasingly Paris, where the number of crashes and collisions are incredibly low. So low, in fact, that most folks there do not wear a helmet, and it's like totally normal and totally fine.
Okay, so Orion next.
Thanks. I'm wondering, as you're talking about bikes and pedestrians and all that, where all these scooters, the new sort of wave of scooters fits in to this. My, I guess, like objective journalist view is that they're incredibly stupid and I hate them. And I don't think they fit in any of those. Like, I don't see where they fit in DC here. People ride them in streets. That doesn't seem like a good idea. They ride them on sidewalks. Doesn't seem like a good idea.
Yeah.
Maybe bike lanes, but I wonder, does that even could they have a place in your view in a transportation system? Would we have to rebuild all that? How do we deal with scooters?
Yeah, so I have to say that my opinion on them is complete opposite of yours. I'm actually really optimistic about their transformational power. Now, I don't want to be too sort of pie in the sky or rosy glasses about them, but I do think that they present an opportunity for like a slow lane, bike lane situation. Folks where there are protected bike lanes that are wide and sort of sufficient are able to ride a scooter in them just fine. And they're at about the same speed as cyclists, particularly now that we have e-bikes. They're sort of operating in the same domain. The problem is we have folks who are fighting over the smallest scraps of road space, right? We're having pedestrians and cyclists and scooters all like clamoring over this tiny bit, whereas drivers have, 99% of the roadway all of the time, sort of no questions asked. And so I'm sure I won't convince you that they're part of the solution. They're not part of the problem, but it's worth looking at what our default expenditures are and what our default sort of distribution of space is. And sort of start asking yourself questions like, is it appropriate that there is, 1,000 parking spots in Washington, D.C., where people could be scootering just fine, right? And safely and getting to where they wanted to go. So yeah, my hope is that eventually we end up with a city that's one where people are scootering and walking and biking all over, and that there are fewer cars and there's much more space for those other modes and much less conflict between them.
But that would basically take like creating new and wider bike lanes or whatever lanes.
Yes. And I think we could do it really quickly, actually, that we could do sort of like pilot project or tactical urbanism projects to remove parking or remove even lanes of travel and put in space for bikes and cars and people. And it's transformative, right? I don't know. Have you guys seen the videos of Paris recently? There are thousands of bikes everywhere and scooters, and they have very dramatically, their new mayor, who has very dramatically sort of reclaimed street space. And if you're in Washington, D.C., or you're in New York, or you're in these cities, you kind of get jealous looking at their bravery. I should say she just won re-election too, so it's a political success story to bet on bikes and people. Highly recommend. Check it out after this.
So following up on that, what cities in the US have done a good job of adding in bike lanes and adding in the network? Are there a few good case studies of cities that have done a good job either building out them from the start or retrofitting in a more congested area and making it work?
I'm always remiss to name cities because the folks who are from those cities are never happy with what they have, right? They always want more. So New York has actually done a pretty remarkable job adding protected bike lanes. Now, their their crash rates are continuing to go up, and advocates there are unhappy with the sufficiency of what's happened. But folks who haven't been to New York in 5 years or so are sort of blown away by what's happening there. Seattle is another place that has done an incredible job. Between their bus-only lanes and their bike infrastructure, this is now a city it's the only city in the United States, actually, where the car use is declining consistently for the past 10 years. Pretty good work. Portland, Los Angeles has actually done quite a bit of work adding in protected bike networks. Minnesota is doing an amazing job. Smaller cities like, where is UC Davis? I can't remember where UC Davis is, but their city is
Davis.
Of course it is. It's early in the morning. I haven't had coffee. Am I allowed to call that?
Okay. All right, Elena next.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay? Great. So thank you so much for doing this. I'm a native New Yorker and don't know how to drive, and I find this very interesting. My question is a little bit on the larger federal scale. I'm just curious, I think about how on a larger scale, some of the times I hear politicians bring these topics up is when they have a personal connection. Like when, I mean, the largest example I can think of, it's not a pedestrian, but, you know, President Joe Biden's, you know, wife and daughter were tragically killed decades ago in a car accident. I'm wondering if you, over your career monitoring this, have noticed specific, maybe federal leaders or prominent local leaders or state leaders that really tout these issues and bring them up. And I guess going off of that, if so, like, who should we watch for stuff like this?
Excellent question. And the best resource I can point you to in this domain is Families for Safe Streets. They partner with a group called Transportation Alternatives in New York City. But this particular branch, Families for Safe Streets, it's a victims' rights organization who swoop in the aftermath of a crash, particularly for parents who have lost their children to car crashes, and provide not only counseling, but then also sort of a community of like-minded sufferers who then take that and advocate for safer streets. So actually, I believe at this moment, they are biking across New York to Albany to bring their case right to lawmakers in Albany. They've got a package of several bills that, you know, are supposed to improve street safety, and they have been remarkably effective. So Families for Safe Streets, their stuff is great. And they have local branches now in many, many states.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, next up, Madison.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I was just thinking, I really wish that I had known this when I was doing local news in college. So I hope you're also sharing this with journalism schools as well.
Yeah.
I had a question about the studies that are kind of focused on pedestrians. Are there any particular groups or interests that are funding those studies? I mean, is it still automobile companies?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's one of the things I felt while I was reading them. I was like, who is paying for this? That these are the results we're getting. It does not appear to be directly funded by automobile companies, as well as I can tell. It does seem to be funded by the National Science Foundation, who has, I don't want to call it a bias, but has a preference for like technology-based solutions. In fact, right now I'm working on, or until very recently, I was working on an NSF project with computer scientists and engineers, and their big plan to improve pedestrian safety was to add a little sound effect on your e-scooter that would alert you to when you were about to be hit by a car. To do what? No one knows. You can't move out of the way of the car. The car is about to hit you. But this sort of like tech-based victim blaming issue is like, it's baked into the recipe now. It's been in the water for so long that we don't even notice it. So I don't actually think that it's kind of like, here, find these results for $100,000. It's just like, we've now gotten a windshield bias, if that makes sense.
Okay, next up, Caroline Simon. And tell her where you're from. I've neglected to be asking people to do that.
Hey, thank you so much for being here. I'm Caroline with CQ Roll Call. I wanted to ask, I know a lot of the coverage that we're talking about is being done by local news outlets, and a lot of the same local news outlets are facing financial struggles, under-resourced, being bought by hedge funds, whatever. If you notice any kind of connection between, potentially understaffed newsrooms and the coverage that you're talking about in terms of, a local journalist maybe doesn't have time to interview a safety expert or something like that because they've got so much else on their plate.
Right. Such an important point, and something I bring up every time I talk about this with public safety folks, because I want them to know that we have a huge responsibility to help. So we did not look directly at the relationship between the amount of resources they have and the quality of their coverage. But I've now spoken to many journalists who say, basically, we're copying and pasting police reports. And so to that end, I'm now working with police in California and New Jersey and Texas to improve their crash reporting practices so that when journalists copy and paste what they say is better, right? So trying to tackle this from multiple different levels. The other thing, every time I talk with my people, transportation people, I tell them proactively, reach out to your local journalist, have a statement ready about the nature of crashes in your city, and have you give them your cell phone number, be available to make that comment. And folks have been really receptive to that. So I'm hoping that those relationships are being built across the country.
Thanks.
Okay, so we have time for a few more questions. One question I had, you made a quick reference to pedestrian safety campaigns don't work. I think that's what you said. Could you give me a little sense about whether I heard that right, and what kind of campaigns cities have tried to do, and if they've shown any measure of success at all?
Sure. So the first thing I should say is that it's very difficult to measure the efficacy of something like a ticket or click it campaign or a look both ways before you cross campaign. But they tend to be incredibly ineffective, right? We don't see any decline in crashes or injuries in places that have embraced this sort of messaging. You might wonder, why does this messaging continue to exist? Well, because there's a dedicated pot of federal funding every year to make public safety campaigns in transportation. And so cities use that money, states use that money, even though it's not been demonstrated to be effective. Sometimes people think that this means that I don't think we should have any messaging for children, look both ways before you cross the street. Of course we should, but we should not sort of rely on that to improve safety. One example that comes to mind every time I think about this is in Seattle. The folks in Seattle noticed that the primary people dying on their streets were senior citizens, and their senior citizens were dying in crosswalks. Okay, their solution, and I believe they had the best of intentions, but their solution was to make flyers at senior citizen centers and other locations where seniors hang out and say, make sure you look both ways before you cross in the crosswalk. Of course, that's not the issue, right? Drivers are running over senior citizens as they cross within crosswalks. The onus shouldn't be on seniors to sort of look both ways. They already are. That's not the issue. So I feel like baked into a lot of this messaging, there's victim blaming baked into it.
Okay. You also made reference to the 10 highest growing states have the highest, or have higher death rates. Did I hear that correctly? And is it just is it mostly because these are Sunbelt states that are the big drivers of growth in the country, and those all happen to be states that have don't quite have the same kind of planned infrastructure as older northeastern states?
That's exactly it, right? We're seeing people leave Massachusetts, New York, places like that, and go to Florida in particular, biggest and baddest in terms of pedestrian safety. But then, like you said, Arizona, Texas, Sunbelt, basically.
Okay. So we have just a few more minutes. Any other questions out there? Adrian.
Hi, thanks for presenting on this. I have a question for you because you mentioned before that there's no great data on this, especially on pedestrian incidents and so on. And I was wondering if there are any databases you would recommend to check in terms of like incidents, but I'm talking about like the individual level or as much granular as possible the data can be. So if there are any databases or datasets that you think would be worth it to check.
Sure. So the first is we have something called the FARS data, Fatality Accident Reporting System, FARS, yeah. Fatality Accident Reporting System. And that's a national database for all fatal crashes. The problem is, and I mentioned this in the presentation, is they do not record whether the driver was distracted or whether the pedestrian was distracted with any regularity. We are seeing improvements in that. Like now that we know that it's such a problem, some local areas are changing their practices, but it relies on police, local police, right? But I can say that there's better data in places like New York City or Philadelphia, where they have open repositories of crash data. Philadelphia's in particular is very good. And so you can see right away where each crash happened, the details of the crash, whether other crashes have happened there. By contrast, just to throw my state under the bus, you can only get access to crash data if you are on a state-sponsored grant to study traffic safety. So if you're a journalist in New Jersey, you can't get your hands on the crash data even if you wanted to, which strikes me as a problem. I think we should be really transparent about where these things are happening.
That FARS database, I'm noticing a problem. If we change the terminology from accidents to crashes, it's going to mess up that acronym.
It really will. Also, our most popular sort of safety journal, transportation safety journal, is called Accident and Injury Prevention. We have to do something about that as well.
All right, so any other final questions here? Seeing none, Kelcie, I want to thank you very much for getting up early Alaska time to come talk with us today.